Did you know that parents rank financial literacy as the #1 most difficult life skill to teach? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app for families. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Kids learn to earn, save, and spend wisely, and parents can rest easy knowing their kids are learning about money with guardrails in place. Try Greenlight risk-free today at greenlight.com/Wondery.
Bombas makes the most comfortable socks, underwear, and T-shirts.
Warning, Bombas are so absurdly comfortable you may throw out all your other clothes.
Sorry, do we legally have to say that?
No, this is just how I talk, and I really love my Bombas.
They do feel that good. And they do good, too. One item purchased equals one item donated.
To feel good and do good, go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY at checkout.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
The Prosecutors is brought to you by Progressive, where drivers who save by switching save over $700 on average. Quote now at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National annual average insurance savings by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2020 and May 2021. Potential savings will vary.
Hello, everyone. This is Mike.
And this is Gibby.
And we're the hosts of the True Crime All the Time Unsolved podcast. If you haven't already, we'd love to invite you to come check us out. Starting in January of 2017, we've amassed over 230 episodes of some of the most intriguing unsolved cases in true crime history. We cover some of the very big unsolved cases, but we also like to cover some of the lesser known cases, some that you may have never heard of. We dive into the details. We talk about the victims, their life, the circumstances around their disappearance or murder, and we cover the potential suspects and persons of interest. We try to give you all the known facts you need to satisfy your amateur detective. We like to think that we don't take ourselves all that seriously, but we take true crime very seriously. You can listen to True Crime All the Time Unsolved now on Podcast One, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
You know you want to.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, we look at the hard evidence in the Casey Anthony case. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my healthy co-host, Alice.
Hey, Brett. I'm sorry you're still feeling sick, but I'm not going to rub in that I'm not sick yet. I'd like to think that I've tried everything I can to join you in your sickness, because I think I spent more hours with you sick than not, and I haven't gotten sick yet, so thank goodness.
I think this is just a deficiency in me, I've decided. I mean, I've taken, I've done all the sort of pop science things. I've taken the zinc pills and the vitamin C and everything else. Ate fresh fruit, but it's like the illness that will never let go. So if, Casey Anthony's the last case I do, carry on without me, Alice.
I'm never doing this podcast without you. I can't handle it without you.
Yes, we're a team. We're a team.
Indeed, we are.
If the team's ever broken, we'll just have to stop. That'll just be it. So hopefully that doesn't happen anytime soon. I will do my best to recover from what seems like an eternal illness, but I'm pushing through with your help. And we're back to talk about Casey Anthony. We talked a lot last time about the psychology of this case and the psychology of Casey Anthony, and it's really one of the most fascinating things about this case. And it's really hard not to be fascinated by it. Frankly, I think you could do just episode after episode after episode on Casey Anthony and her lies and the psychology of her family. But today we wanted to move on and talk about the hard evidence. Before we do that, though, I do want to say one more thing about Casey Anthony's psychology, because there's one more story that I wanted to say for this episode so that you can sort of remember this as we talk about the hard evidence and how does it color what we see in the forensics of this case. And that takes us to around July 4th. Around that time, Casey's boyfriend, Tony Lazzaro, had gone back to New York. New York was where he was from. And there was even some talk that he might need to stay there. I can't remember exactly why, if there was an illness in the family or something along those lines. Tony would actually end up coming back, but he was gone for the July 4th holiday. Casey went out of town with some of her friends. She actually met another guy that she was texting back and forth with. Around July 5th, July 6th, Tony comes back and he recounts a story about how one night, right around then, he wakes up and Casey is not in bed. So he gets up to sort of find her, and he finds her sitting on the floor with her laptop, crying, watching videos of Kaylee. And it's one of those things, what exactly is going through her mind at that point? This is about 3 weeks after Kaylee has gone missing. I also wonder what was going through his mind at this time. This is something that wasn't really investigated, but why did no one around Casey ever question the fact that suddenly Kaylee's just gone? But in any event, she is watching these videos, obviously upset. What does that mean? And what does it tell us about what happened to Kaylee, and how does it maybe color some of the evidence we're going to look at now, starting with maybe the most important evidence, the evidence from Casey's own trunk?
And Brett, that is such a good question that you asked there that I think we need to think about as we look at the evidence, is that while Casey was the one on trial, there were many people, there was a community around her, friends, family, boyfriends, who interacted frequently with her daughter, Kaylee. And it's just interesting how it got to this point, how it got to the point where no one saw Kaylee for a month. And now we've already seen, we've already started releasing Casey Anthony episodes. So we've seen a lot of you kind of say things along the lines, she was acquitted because the prosecution overcharged, or, somehow there wasn't enough evidence. The only way to really be able to analyze whether those things are true is to look at the actual evidence. We've talked a lot about the psychology. We've talked a lot about behaviors. But what is the hard evidence that we can look to that is not subjective? Well, let's talk about Casey's car, and specifically the trunk. The smell of decomposition was so strong that when the police parked the car in a 2-bay garage, the smell filled the entire garage. A police cadaver dog alerted on the trunk. When the police opened it, they noticed a couple of things. One, it has clearly been vacuumed out. And second, there is a stain in the trunk about the size of a small body. The police removed some of the lining of the trunk to test it, and they also noticed hairs that they believe are Kaylee's. These hairs have what is called post-mortem banding, which indicates that they are from after Kaylee died. Now, the police attempt to do vapor analysis on the lining of the trunk that they removed. This is done based on the theory that a decomposing body leaves certain chemical traces in the air and surface where it is present. By testing the gases that are produced when the lining was placed in a sealed container, the vapor analysis revealed the presence of decomposition gases. Dr. Arpad Vas testified that in addition to decomposition gases, there was the presence of chloroform at high levels. This supported the web searches regarding how to produce chloroform. if chloroform was present, it supported a premeditation theory because it's not something that is just readily available to Casey.
Yeah, chloroform's not one of those things you just kind of keep around the house, generally speaking. And we talked about these web searches earlier. And, probably not the kind of web search you typically see. Web searches about chloroform. I don't know that I've ever searched for chloroform or how to make chloroform. But if you look at the history of the family computer, you're going to see that. Now, we're going to talk in a minute about a possible explanation for that. We'll see how much of that you believe. But here's the thing. This sounds really great, right? I mean, this sounds really powerful. You've got the trunk, and you've got these decomposition gases, and you've got this chloroform, and you have this Dr. Vass who's testifying about all this stuff. And it sounds powerful, but it's going to be interesting to watch how the defense starts to bring some of this down. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this post-mortem banding. So this is something that apparently only happens when hair is still attached to the head while decomposition is ongoing. So, for instance, if this hair had fallen off of Kaylee while she was still alive, it would not have this banding. It would not band on its own. She would need to be dead, and then the banding would occur. It's not something I know a lot about, but there was testimony about it at the trial. And look, it's important whether or not Kaylee's body was in the trunk of that car. This is Casey's car. And if it was in the trunk of the car, that is going to be a problem for some of the defense theories that we're going to talk about later. So everything sounds great, right? Sounds like we have a strong basis here for some real scientific evidence that Kaylee's body was in that car. But this is where we start to see the defense. And we're going to talk about how this was a very good defense. And the defense did a really good job of both bringing down some of the prosecution's arguments while also bringing enough confusion into the case to allow the jury to acquit in the end. And look, it is certainly possible that the chemicals weren't actually related to chloroform. This is something that was brought out in cross-examination. They are also consistent with many standard cleaning products. This is a problem because the main ingredient in homemade chloroform is bleach. So if you were going to make chloroform, you're going to use bleach. So when you talk about finding markers of chloroform, you might just be finding bleach. Now, this is sort of a double-edged sword for the defense, right? Because the trunk has been vacuumed. There's some evidence of cleaning. It probably was cleaned with bleach. Why did that happen? Probably because there was a dead body in there. That's probably the reason that bleach was present. But the defense, they're not really worried about that so much as to say, look, this guy's up here on the stand, this very important witness that the prosecution's called for. They're saying he's an expert. He's telling you there's chloroform in there. Well, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? Maybe she just bought bleach and, put it in the trunk of her car while she took it to her house. And that's what he's saying. And if you can't trust him on that, then can you really trust him on all this other stuff? And then the defense is going to be able to point to some testimony by Cindy. We're going to talk about that in a second. When they're talking about these searches, where Cindy provides a reason for this chloroform search that might be unrelated to the death. So you've got this sort of dual attack. Isn't it much more likely this is just bleach than chloroform on the one hand? And, oh, by the way, the only reason they even think there's chloroform is because of this search. Well, we have an explanation for that. Listen to Cindy's testimony. So, I don't know. I mean, honestly, I just got to tell you, I don't think there was chloroform involved in this case. I think chloroform is way too complicated. I can't imagine Casey Anthony actually making chloroform. Yes, the theory is that she uses the chloroform to knock her out and then either kills her, or the intention was to knock her out so she could go party, and she uses too much and she dies. Okay, maybe. I think it's much more likely she just used bleach to clean that trunk. And this chloroform thing is just a red herring. She may have searched for chloroform on the computer, and knowing Casey probably was like, man, this is way too complicated. I'm not going to bother myself with this. I just don't imagine Casey in the kitchen like some sort of mad scientist making chloroform.
Yeah, especially because we know that the car has been vacuumed as well, and the trunk has been vacuumed. So it kind of goes hand in hand, the cleaning with the bleach with the vacuuming. And if she had just wanted to use chloroform to, not necessarily kill Kaylee, but rather, like you said, drug her enough to be able to have her, sleep so that Casey could go party. The problem with that is her daughter probably would wake up and remember something about that and be able to say something at some point. And I would think she doesn't want to risk something like that. So it seems that chloroform is kind of so, it requires so much effort. And she does not seem like she'd be someone who'd do that sort of effort and pre-planning in order to do it. And, if anything, though, it gives the jury an out for the gases that these doctors and the forensic analysts found, which begins to kind of sow that reasonable doubt.
And, just walk through how this probably went down. Kaylee dies. We'll get to how she dies later. Maybe she was murdered. Maybe it was an accident. At some point, Casey decides she's got to get rid of the body for whatever reason. And at some point, the body ends up in the trunk. We talked about the trash in the trunk and how the obvious reason you put the trash in the trunk is to cover up the smell. I think the way this probably went was Kaylee's in the trunk. She's in the trunk for several days. Decomposition begins. It begins to smell. People start to comment on it. People who ride with Casey are like, man, what in the world is wrong with your car? And she says, oh, I think my dad ran over an animal. I think there's an animal stuck in the undercarriage. I mean, that's what she tells people. It's what she tells her friends. So at some point, I think she thinks, man, I got to get rid of this smell. So the first thing she does, which is kind of the first thing I would do. I mean, I don't know if you guys, if you ever have like a trash can or something that stinks, you're like pouring baking soda in there and maybe you're throwing some bleach in there. You're trying to get rid of the smell, right? I could imagine she takes some bleach and she tries to bleach it out, thinking the bleach will kill whatever's making the smell to get rid of the smell to cover it up. That doesn't work. So then she goes to the garbage. That's sort of how I imagine her going. The initial vacuum is to get rid of any evidence. The bleach is to get rid of the smell. It doesn't work. And so she puts the garbage in the trunk. So there's a plausible reason for the smell other than there's been a dead body there. I think that's the most likely thing. And then you have Vass who comes along and he's like, oh, chloroform, right? And that unfortunately seems like kind of I don't know, to me, it seems like a crazy thing. Making your own chloroform just seems like a stretch, but that's what he's saying happens. In the defense, they grab onto this. They don't only attack him for that and noting that, this could just be bleach. They go right after his science as well. So the vapor analysis that we're talking about here, it had never been used in court before. So it wasn't used in any crime lab in the United States. It was a totally new science, to the extent it was a science at all. Vass has a PhD in anthropology, not chemistry, and this science requires a chemistry analysis. So the defense really goes after him for this. Initially, they try and keep it out altogether. They basically make an argument under Daubert and a few other cases that this is not established science and it should not be allowed. This is a pretrial argument. It's something that's done outside the presence of the jury. And the prosecution has to put on evidence that even though it's never been used before, fingerprints were used for the first time in a trial at some point. DNA was used for the first time in a trial at some point. So you just have to build that it's reliable, that it's science-based, that it's replicable, that it's not complete quackery, right? In order to get it in. And they were able to get past that hurdle. And actually, I think it ended up hurting them because the defense just hammered this whole... So you have a jar full of air and you're testing the jar full of air and that's your science. And it's like you somehow magically determined there's quote unquote decomposition gases and that's your thing. And it actually kind of turned into a circus. And Vass himself took a huge hit in his career as a result of this trial. It kind of blew up on him. And honestly, he's not really bathed himself in glory since then. He actually now works at the Tennessee Body Farm, and he teaches his students, law enforcement officers from around the country, how to use dowsing rods to find bodies. Now, Alice, do you know what a dowsing rod is?
Not an idea.
Okay, so a dowsing rod, it can be one of two things. It's either a Y-shaped stick or it's two L-shaped pieces of metal that you hold in each hand. and you sort of walk around, and when the sticks cross, that means whatever you're looking for is there. In this case, a body. Sometimes people douse for water.
Is it science-based?
Sometimes we call it witching for water.
Like, what makes the sticks cross?
Witching for bodies. So the fact that it's called witching is probably a bad sign. I mean, look, I'm not the kind of person who would say that there is no way this works. It is not science. What makes the sticks cross is probably some psychosomatic reaction, right? And Voss has this whole theory about how it works and the energy from the bodies connecting to the dowsing rods. And the fact that people are actually being trained in how to do this, and it has been used in trials. This dowsing thing has now been used in trials where they have found bodies, quote unquote, using it. And I mean, I don't know. That's his thing, though. That's one of the things he does. He also has something that has sort of derisively been called a fingernail gun that he claims can find a missing body using the DNA of the missing person, say from their fingernails. So you put the fingernails in the gun and it like heats it up and somehow it locates the body, even if it's like hundreds of miles away. Like he gets up in a helicopter with this fingernail gun and sort of like points it at the ground to find these bodies. So anyways, so this guy, kind of crazy. Maybe not somebody you want to rely on in a trial. And this was really bad for the prosecution. We talked about this before. Sometimes it's not the evidence and it's not what you're saying to the jury, it's how you're saying it. And Voss came off so badly that the jury would later say that he was a huge weakness for the government, and that this expert testimony they're hearing that fell so flat seriously hurt their case. You guys have asked us before, how do juries make a determination when you have two experts, one who's saying one thing, one who's saying another? Well, this is one way. Cross-examination of an expert can be really, really powerful. If the government's own expert is flailing on the stand, that can really put some doubt in the jury. And I think it's kind of crazy because there was good, ordinary evidence that this body was in the trunk. There was a smell that multiple people had smelled. There was the hair with the banding. There was the presence of flies. We can talk about all this stuff. Dogs. I mean, there's all sorts of ordinary science. But then you had Vass come in with his decomposition gases. And I think the jury forgot all that stuff and they focused entirely on him.
Yeah, Brett, that's such an interesting thing you say, because sometimes when you are getting ready for a case, especially for trial, you can get tunnel vision as the attorneys, and you're kind of looking at all the evidence. You have so many avenues you're pursuing at the same time, from the practical, how do you get your papers up to the podium without dropping them, to how you organize your notes, to the larger strategy. And you have to have a full view of every witness you are putting on the stand, experts definitely included. So it's not enough when you get an expert report saying what you wanted to say, right? What likely happened in terms of the sequence of events is they needed an expert to talk about what was found in the trunk. They may have shopped around. Someone may have recommended Voss, but Voss's report probably came back, whether it was a written report or an oral report where he says, look, I've done this vapor analysis. It is new, but here are all the reasons you should trust me. And by the way, what I found through this vapor analysis 100% confirms what you think happened, which is that Kaylee's body was decomposing in Casey's trunk. And instead of maybe looking at his entire body of work, his other testimonies, they may have just kind of lashed on like, this is perfect. This is exactly what we were looking for. And they may not have questioned what Voss actually had said elsewhere. So when we are looking at our witnesses, we go on like court dockets and type in the expert's name and try to read every transcript of every time that they have testified to see how they came off on direct, on cross-examination, if they've ever had a Daubert finding against them, if another court has said that they're not an expert in that area. We try to read and talk to any other attorneys who have used that expert, their experience with them, their expertise. We try to Google them. People write things on Google all the time now about everyone, including doctors and experts and PhDs, and try to kind of pick apart and do what the defense is doing for your expert as the prosecution before we even decide to put this person on the stand or decide to hire them. And that's all relevant here because if you make a misstep, like I think the prosecution did with Voss's expert testimony, it turns into a complete sideshow that distracts from the main purpose that you are there.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, this is a prosecutor's nightmare. You're going to have this great case and all this evidence, and you're laying it out, and then one thing happens, and that's the thing everybody remembers, and that's the thing the jury latches onto. Because remember, I mean, if the jury has reasonable doubt, you lose. So if they have a reason to have doubt, then you lose. And you think about all the evidence they had of the presence of that body in that car, but then they have Vass come on and look like a complete moron with this crazy science that may or may not be legitimate. And if it was, he wasn't the best person to present it. And the jury probably went back in that jury room and thought, well, I think there was a body in there, but man, that Voss guy, he was all over the place. I mean, that's the person they want us to believe. They want us to find this person guilty on that guy's testimony. And for those of you who wonder, how did the jury reach this conclusion? You've all heard about Voss and his crazy testimony and the jars of air and everything else, but you didn't live it. You didn't experience it like the jury did. And it's hard to say just how much of an effect that had on him. Think of OJ and the whole glove thing, right? I mean, the OJ trial went for months, and there was tons of evidence and all kinds of forensics. And the only thing anybody remembers is if the glove don't fit, you must have quit, you know? And I kind of feel like this was a glove moment for them where things fell apart, and it was really hard to put it back together, even though they had other experts who were saying things. So like Alice said, we had the dog. The dog is hitting on the trunk multiple times that there was a body in that trunk. And dogs, they can be flawed, but if you've already got suspicion that there was a body in a certain place and the dog hits on it, that's pretty good confirmation. In addition to that, you also had experts testify about the presence of flies in the trunk that would have been consistent with the presence of a decomposing body. The defense tried to mitigate this a little bit by saying, well, there should have been even more flies if there had been a body. And maybe these flies are just related to the garbage in the trunk. But the expert for the prosecution was very clear. These are not the kind of flies that you have on garbage. I don't know a lot about flies, but apparently there are things called coffin flies, which specifically lay their eggs in decomposing human flesh. And the flies that they found in the trunk were consistent with the flies that were around the location where they found Kaylee's body. So that was a pretty powerful piece of evidence that you've got this larva that is unique to decomposing bodies. It matches up with both in the trunk and at the body dump location. And to the extent there weren't more flies, remember, the trunk had clearly been cleaned. And honestly, if the prosecution had just gone with the bleach and not the chloroform, they could have used the bleach as an example of how the trunk has clearly been cleaned. But they're down the chloroform, they're down the Arpod Vass thing on that. But nevertheless, coffin flies, pretty powerful, particularly when you stick that with the dog. And then you have this whole weird confrontation over the gas cans. We talked about this when we went through the timeline, that Casey had stolen some gas cans. She brings them back. George confronts her. George is like, where is Kaylee? And they're screaming at each other. And George makes a move to get his gas cans, and Casey will not let him near the car. Instead, she goes, runs back to the trunk, grabs the gas cans out of the trunk, and throws them at him. Now, obviously, if there were a body in the back, that would be significant. Though at the time, George said he did not smell a body, even though this gas can-related event happened on June 23rd, only 2 days before it was towed from the parking lot where it was found, in which case George did smell a body. Now, that could have just been the direction of the wind or whatever. It's pretty clear that if the car smelled like a body 2 days later, it would have smelled like a body then. And there is other testimony of Casey's friends who had ridden in that car who said that by that point, it smelled like a body. So you put all that together, and it really feels like there was a body in the trunk of that car, even though Vass's testimony may have blinded the jury to this other evidence and allowed them an out. The Prosecutors is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Most of you listening right now are probably multitasking. Yep, while you're listening to me talk, you're probably also driving, cleaning, exercising, or maybe even grocery shopping. But if you're not in some kind of moving vehicle, there's something else you can be doing right now. Getting an auto quote from Progressive Insurance. It's easy and can save you money by doing it right from your phone. Drivers who save by switching to Progressive save over $700 on average, and auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Discounts for having multiple vehicles on your policy, being a homeowner, and more. So just like your favorite podcast, Progressive will be with you 24/7, 365 days a year, so you're protected no matter what. Multitask right now. Quote your car insurance at Progressive.com to join the over 27 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National annual average insurance savings by new customers surveyed who save with Progressive between June 2020 and May 2021. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations. Guys, as you know, I've been sick, and one of the few things that's been able to give me any relief is Tivic Clear Up. If you've got sinus pain, congestion, heaviness in the face and eyes, headaches, runny nose, or watery eyes, over-the-counter and prescription drugs with side effects and messy sprays are a hard way to live for many people suffering from these conditions. I'm here to tell you about a revolutionary product that will change your life forever. Introducing Tivic Clear Up, an easy-to-use, FDA-approved medical device that fits in the palm of your hand. Created by doctors and neuroscientists, Tivic Clear Up stops suffering by using bioelectronic technology to reduce sinus pain and congestion. Simply glide Tivic Clear Up on areas of your face where you're experiencing sinus pain. Try Tivic Clear Up today with a 60-day risk-free trial. Go to TivicHealth.com, that's TIVIC health.com, and enter promo code PROSECUTORS22 to receive $20 off plus free shipping on your Clear Up device. That's PROSECUTORS22 to receive $20 off plus free shipping. Tivic Clear Up works when nothing else can. Everybody, it's a tough time for all of us making ends meet. Inflation is soaring. Gas prices are sky high. And if you've got credit card debt or other kind of debts, it can make it really hard just to meet your minimum payments. And if you're somebody who's paying down old credit card debt, a personal loan could be your solution. Loans usually come with fixed monthly payments, making them a simple way to help pay off your credit cards. Plus, loans usually have lower interest rates than credit cards too, and Credit Karma can help you find the best option for you. Credit Karma uses your credit data to find loan offers that are personalized to you so you can have a better idea of what loan amount you can get approved for. Credit Karma will even show you your chances of approval so you can choose between loan offers that you're more likely to get approved for and apply with more confidence. Comparing loan offers on Credit Karma is 100% free and won't affect your credit scores, and you could save money. Credit Karma, apply with more confidence today. If you are ready to apply, head to creditkarma.com/loan offers to see personalized offers. Go to creditkarma.com/loan offers to find the loan for you. That's creditkarma.com/loan offers. Guys, there's nothing I love more than meat, and there's nothing I love more in the summer than grilling that meat, whether it's steaks or ribs or chicken or pork. It's what I love, and that's why I love Butcher Box. It was 4th of July. We had a slab of ribs from Butcher Box. We put those babies in the smoker. We let them go all day, and they were fall off the bone good. Butcher Box is the kind of quality you would get from a neighborhood butcher delivered to your front door. It gives you more convenience and a good price. In fact, every month, Butcher Box ships a curated selection of high-quality meat right to your home. There's free shipping for the continental U.S. There is no reason not to do this. And this is delicious, 100% grass-fed beef, free-range organic chicken, pork-raised crate-free, and wild-caught seafood. We are talking less than $6 per meal on average. That can make a huge difference in your life, especially right now when prices seem like they are only going up. So get summer sizzling started with this special Butcher Box deal for our listeners. Free bacon for life, which is basically the greatest deal in the history of mankind, of your membership plus $10 off. That's free bacon for life of your membership plus $10 off. Sign up today at butcherbox.com/prosecute and use code prosecute to get 1 pack of free bacon in every box for the life of your membership plus $10 off your first order. It is a deal you cannot beat, and you need to get it now. That's butcherbox.com/prosecute and use code prosecute to claim this deal.
When you kind of remove the sideshow, there is so much evidence that goes in favor of the prosecution's theory that Kaylee, after she'd been dead, was in that trunk. But let's talk more about the hard evidence that we have in this case so far, and that's Kaylee's autopsy report. Now, the autopsy report, unsurprisingly, could not determine the cause of death given the time that had passed. But it did have some interesting findings. The body was in 2 plastic bags and a canvas bag. The skeleton had been dispersed, probably due to animals. We've talked about this before. Foragers, they kind of drag, especially the smaller bones, and it causes them to scatter over time. And we know that Kaylee's body had been out there for months in the elements, even though it was in the canvas bag and 2 plastic bags. Now, she'd been out there for so long that plants had actually begun to grow in her vertebrae. And a few more months and the skeleton might never have been found. That's kind of how taken over by nature it was at that point when they found her body. Now, when they found the skeleton in the bags, they also found there was duct tape wrapped partway around Kaylee's skull. It covered the mouth and then reached to the hair. There were 3 pieces of duct tape. The duct tape still had scalp hairs on it. And it also covered both the mandible, which is the lower jaw, and the maxilla, the upper jaw. In fact, although the tissue had all decayed away, the mandible was still in the approximate location that it would have been in life, held there by the duct tape. So at trial, the defense would attempt to undermine this, noting that if the duct tape was placed on the body before decomposition, as stated in the autopsy report, it should have slipped off when the skin and muscle decayed. And in fact, there was no evidence of human tissue on the duct tape itself. But the prosecution's expert had an explanation for this. First, the body had been in a swamp for many months. Whatever had been on the duct tape would have been destroyed. As to the rest, the duct tape had held the skull in place while decomposition occurred. But it remained in place because of the matted hair underneath the duct tape. The duct tape itself would not have held the mandible in place the whole time, but it did so long enough that the hair did the rest. Now, there was no antemortem trauma to the skeleton. In other words, whatever killed Kaylee, it wasn't being beaten to death.
So the duct tape is important for a few reasons. Number one, you sometimes hear that the duct tape was wrapped around Kaylee's head 3 times. That seems not to be true. You hear it a lot. I mean, you hear it so much that I hate to even say it's not true. But based on watching the testimony and the way the testimony came in and reading some about the links of the duct tape, I think it's that there are 3 pieces of duct tape that go partially around Kaylee's head. But it's not that it was wrapped around 3 times. That's the first thing. Either way, it doesn't really matter. There are 3 pieces of duct tape on a child's face. It's difficult to imagine why that would be there. And this was a huge problem for the defense. I mean, how exactly does duct tape get on to the face of a child as the result of an accident? And they don't really have a good explanation for this. Now, they'll call Warner Spitz, who seems like he shows up in all these cases, and he would argue it was impossible to say where the duct tape actually was or how Kaylee died. It's true, it's impossible to say how she died. But this notion that somehow the duct tape had sort of migrated to Kaylee's face, that it was on the bag or something, just seems utterly bizarre to me. Spitz would talk about how there should have been DNA on the duct tape, but this is incredibly weak. As Alice just said, the body's in a jungle in Florida in the summer. There's not going to be any DNA on the duct tape. It's just not going to happen. It's out in the middle of nowhere. Spitz also makes some crazy statements about how maybe the body was placed there later on, and I don't know. You know, it's funny. The longer you do this whole true crime thing, the less respect you have for people whose names you've heard a lot of times. And this was one where, if you listen to Spitz's testimony, it's so absurd that it's obvious he's just doing what he was paid to do. He was hired to be a defense expert, and he was going to give a defense expert position because the things he says don't make any sense. But nevertheless, he is famous, he is an expert, and he did give the jury another read to hang on to. But for me, the duct tape is incredibly important. I don't understand how the duct tape is at all consistent with this being an accident. It's just impossible. And the fact that you had animal predation, you had animals scattering the bones, but the jawbone is still there, exactly where it should have been in life. And it's like held in place by that matted hair, which clearly is matted because there's duct tape wrapped around it. To me, that just shows that this duct tape was on her face when she died, or at least soon after, before she was dumped, that duct tape was put on her face. And, go back to John Bonet. It's hard to imagine why the garrote. Why do you do that if you're trying to stage a crime, right? We talked about how hard it is to believe that two parents would decide there's been this accident. We need to make it look like a crime, which is a weird thing to do anyway. I mean, the way we're going to do it is the most vicious, violent thing we can imagine. We're going to use a garrote, right? And it's like, why would you do that? Same thing here. If you've had an accident and Kaylee drowned in the pool, what is the purpose of putting duct tape on her face? Why would you even think to do that? Why would you make the accident look like a murder? And particularly in this case where you were presumably getting rid of the body forever. It's not even like the Ramsey case where eventually you expect the body to be found and you need it to look like some sort of murder. Here, you're just getting rid of the body, but you're putting duct tape on your baby's face after she died accidentally. You would not do that. There is no circumstance in which you would do that.
Yeah, Brett. I mean, it seems pretty clear this duct tape wasn't an afterthought as part of the body dumping process, because the fact that she was in 3 bags, canvas bag, 2 black bags, the hope was that she would never be found. And in fact, the experts are saying if they had been delayed a few more months, her body never may have been found, because essentially the plant life would have grown all through her skeleton, and it would have been just about impossible to see or find her bones. And then they would have been scattered even further once the plant matter kind of pushed through the rest of her bones. And there's just no reason post-mortem to add the duct tape. Now, we've talked a bit about the web searches that the prosecution found. Throughout the trial, the prosecution stated that Casey had searched the word chloroform 84 different times. This was obviously a powerful point in their favor, and so it was repeated ad nauseum. Chloroform showed up so many times in this trial from the prosecution's side. But we've already kind of touched on this. The problem is that it just wasn't true. The person who testified to the 84 searches realized afterwards that the software he used to analyze the computer was defective. He redesigned the software, ran the program again, and realized that the search had happened just one single time, not 84 times. Now, this guy who had testified in court that chloroform was searched by Casey Anthony 84 times was absolutely distraught. He called the lead detective to let him know about the error on June 25th. The prosecution never corrected the record and did not alert the defense of this newfound information as they were required to do. They would later say that they had prepared a correction while the jury was deliberating, but the verdict came back so quickly they did not have a chance to file it. Now, I don't know what it means by they have to file something. When you find new information that could be exonerating, especially if it goes directly against testimony the jury has already heard, you don't care about what form that correction takes. You pick up the phone, you run and shout out to the defense as soon as you can this new information that is directly in contradiction to what has been said under oath in front of the jury. So it's not an excuse. In fact, if you know of this information before a verdict is read, even if the jury comes in and hands a verdict form to the court bailiff, you stand up and say, Your Honor, can we excuse the jury before we hear the verdict? There's information that we need to talk to the court about. That's what you do. There's always time, right? Any of you who've watched a trial know how slowly things move. Really kind of for this type of purpose. There are no surprises. Nothing is off the cuff. Everything is deliberate and slow. And there's almost always time to correct your error. Now, had the jury found Casey guilty, it is possible, if not likely, that this mistake by the prosecution would have led to a vacated conviction on appeal or even in the post-judgment stage. But of course, we know that the jury came back and actually acquitted Casey.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those, the delta between 1 and 84 is kind of big. We're not talking like, oh, I said it was 82, right, and it was really 80. or something like that. I mean, 1 and 84. 84 sounds like somebody's put a lot of effort into learning about chloroform. 1 sounds like, oh, maybe it was a mistake. And the fact that they knew about this on June 25th, closing arguments weren't until July 3rd. So there was a lot of time that passed there. And you may be saying, well, the detective knew, but the prosecution didn't. For the purposes of this, it's one team. And if the detective knew, he needed to immediately tell the prosecution. And as soon as they knew, as Alice said, they needed to immediately alert the defense and the court. And as Alice said, it does not need to be in some filing. I mean, you can make a filing to make it official, but you need to alert the people who need to know this as soon as possible.
And the reason you need to do this is, especially if the closing arguments have not happened and the jury has not gone back to deliberate, there's a cure for this. The defense can call this guy back on the stand, and he can then rebut what he said earlier and talk about the fact that there was a glitch in the software. And when he realized there was a glitch and how he realized the glitch, he redesigned the software to make sure there was no glitch. And when he ran the program on Casey's computer, all he found was 1. So this is testimony that could have come out, and it would have, changed his previous testimony. Like we said, a trial is kind of this living, breathing animal that keeps going. And just because something's been said before, it's not necessarily set in stone. That's why trials are really an art, not a science, because how jurors perceive witnesses, how they see them, how they smell them, how they see if they're, sweating under cross-examination, and how they speak all goes to their credibility. So if this guy is as distraught as it appears he is, you would probably perceive that on the stand if he were called a second time. And his distraughtness probably would make him come off as very trustworthy, that he wasn't trying to say what the prosecution wanted him to say the first time, and that it was an honest mistake on his part. And when he found out his mistake, he was so distraught that he needed to tell someone right away. And he is on the stand looking so mortified that his glitched software could potentially, have given that information that would have convicted someone wrongfully. But in any event, at trial, this search was explained in a way that defied expectation. So Cindy claimed that it was she, not Casey, that had searched for chloroform. Just think about this for a second. We now know that there were not 84 searches for chloroform, yet Cindy takes ownership of those searches. She explained that her dogs had been sluggish after eating some bamboo, and she intended to search for chlorophyll, not chloroform. Now, this explanation seems outlandish, and the prosecution attempted to show that the searches, which had occurred in March of 2008, happened while Cindy was at work. But Cindy was adamant those were her searches. 84 times she searched chloroform, intending to search chlorophyll for her dogs.
And I think it's really interesting because I think it tells you two things. I think the first thing is it probably actually was Cindy. Now that you know there's only one search, it probably was actually Cindy who searched for chloroform, weirdly, while looking for chlorophyll. And that would explain how this is all a red herring and there wasn't chloroform involved and it was just bleach in the car. But the other thing it tells you is Cindy is willing to lie for Casey. Because if Cindy's willing to take ownership of 84 searches for chloroform when it turns out that it wasn't searched 84 times, then it just goes to show you that she was willing to take the hit, to be on the stand and say, no, this was all me. When she would have thought at the time, man, I did it that one time. But the other times must have been her. But no. She was willing to explain this away. Now, in her actual testimony, there's these questions about how many times or whatever, and it's just never really clear. But nevertheless, I mean, the fact that she's willing to take this hit, I think is really interesting and says something about her and sort of says something about the totality of the way the family reacts to this entire case. So the chloroform, that whole web search is kind of a loser, right? And that's the search that the prosecution found. But the prosecution, in one more of its finer moments, did not find a far more important web search. You may be wondering why we didn't mention the search for foolproof suffocation. We mentioned it earlier when we talked about it in the timeline, but we haven't mentioned it here in what the prosecution has presented to the jury, and that's because they did not present it to the jury. Shockingly, even though the police were aware that Casey often used Firefox as her browser of choice, they did not bother to search her deleted Firefox browsing history, the browsing history that she deleted that day when Cindy called 911 about Kaylee being missing. And it was only years later that it was revealed that on June 16th, the day that Kaylee went missing, in fact, at a time when only Casey was present at the home because it was after her father had left for work, someone searched for foolproof suffocation on that browser. This evidence never came before the jury. Jose Baez in his book would try and argue that Casey, or maybe George, if he were still around, was considering suicide after Kaylee's death. Maybe, or maybe, and more likely, someone, and it could only really be Casey, was looking for ways to kill Kaylee.
And this makes so much sense now why the prosecution had brought on Vass, who, of course, talked about the, jar of air analysis and chloroform kind of being their story of how Casey killed Kaylee, because they had no idea that she had made this search the day that, Kaylee went missing. This is huge. This all makes a lot more sense because they were trying to connect the dots with the information they did know. And this is a massive, massive piece of information. And some of you may be thinking, well, if we do know she searched this on June 16, even if it's years later, why can't we file newly discovered evidence motion or something along those lines? And that's because there's double jeopardy. She went to trial, and this is why in a prosecution, you have to be ready to go to trial when you indict your case. There's Speedy Trial Act. You can't drag on a case indefinitely for you to get ready for trial. So when you indict a case or charge a case, the clock starts ticking and you're kind of stuck with your case file. You can, of course, keep doing, witness interviews and prepping and getting experts and whatnot, but the bulk of your investigation really needs to be finished before you charge a case. And this is the reason. The fact that this information wasn't known to the prosecution is literally a too bad for the prosecution. Even though we now know this to be true, you can't go back in time and re-indict Casey or try to open back up the jury somehow for deliberation and say, wait, we left out some really important information we think you should know about. You can't do that because the Constitution guarantees that you can only be tried once. So now, this is the brilliance of the defense. So what do you do with that if you are a defense? Because this is a lot of really damning evidence that we've said so far that points fingers to Casey having murdered her child. Now, faced with a dead child and a mother who had not reported her missing for a month, the case seemed like a slam dunk. How could Casey not be guilty of murder? But then the defense came up with a theory that somehow managed to take Casey Anthony's lies, the dumping of the body, and her behavior, and turn it into a theory that gave the jury a possible out. Remember, as the defense, you're trying to create enough reasonable doubt for the jury to hang or to acquit your client. Now, kind of one of the most effective ways to do that, instead of just poking holes, is to give an alternate story with the same set of facts that the prosecution has presented to the jury to consider to convict. If you can weave another story, connect the dots in a different way, that gives an alternative outcome that the jury can kind of hang their hat on and say, well, if this is even possible, then is that reasonable doubt and therefore acquit? So the defense gave the jury a story that ended with Casey being not guilty of murdering her daughter.
And a lot of you have been hoping that we're going to slam Jose Baez and talk about how terrible he is and how awful he is. And that ain't going to happen because he may be an awful person and he may be a scumbag. I don't know. I've never met him. But he was brilliant when he approached this case because what a typical defense attorney would have done is they would have done a lot of what he did. They would have poked holes. They would have presented alternative theories. They would have shown how the science wasn't completely accurate. And then at the end, they would have said, look, we've poked holes. That Vass guy, you can't trust him. How can you know for certain that Casey is the one who did this? And maybe that would have worked. Maybe it wouldn't have. I don't think it would have. But what they did instead is they went with the classic, the best story wins approach. They gave the jury an actual story, an alternative story, and said to them, can you be sure that this story that we're going to tell you is not what happened? And if you can't be sure that that story is not what happened, how can you convict? That's essentially what they said. And in a shocker, in the opening statement, the defense tells us exactly how Kaylee died. They didn't leave it a mystery. They didn't say we don't know. They didn't stick with this crazy Zanny the nanny thing. They said Kaylee had drowned in the middle of the night when she slipped through the sliding glass door, and they even had a picture of her opening the sliding glass door, and climbed into the pool using the ladder that had been left down the night before when she went swimming with Cindy, and drowned. The next morning, Casey's sleeping in, because that's what Casey does. George is looking for Kaylee. He can't find her. He goes in Casey's room. She's not in Casey's room. And he's like, where is Kaylee? And the two of them start looking, and they find Kaylee dead in the pool that morning. Casey's freaking out. George is mad at her and telling her, your mother will never forgive you. But at some point, he sort of goes into dad mode, and he says, look, I will take care of it. Now, he didn't exactly tell her what he was going to do, but he took the body. He is the one who dumped the body. He got rid of the body. And then you remember that phone call? We talked about this phone call when we were talking about the timeline. How there was a phone call from George that day while he was at work. It was very short, just a few seconds, 20 seconds. That was the phone call where George told Casey, it's done, it's taken care of, don't worry about it. And this was all to prevent Casey from getting into trouble for child neglect. It was to prevent her mother from never forgiving her again. And Casey went along with it because Casey was willing to do that. And George, he dumps the body in the woods and he wraps the duct tape around her face, I guess to make it look like a murder in case the body was ever found. And the defense supported the theory by noting that the timeline doesn't really work out. We talked about this earlier. The timeline is weird the day that Kaylee disappeared. You got George, who's adamant that Casey left at 12:50. Right, I mean, that's what he's saying. She's gone at 12:50. And yet there's evidence that Casey was on the computer after that time, before George left. And you've got George, who's adamant that he remembers exactly what Kaylee was wearing that day, even though he wasn't asked about it for a month. And even though he did not know that would be the last time he saw her. Remember, he remembers the time because he's watching that show whose name I can't remember and people made fun of me for last time. So I'm not going to repeat it. But he's watching that show. So that's why he remembers the time. But why does he remember the clothes? Why are the clothes burned into his mind? Now, this is a total stunner. And it explains some of what Casey does. Rather than, deny the crime, she accepts it. Look, this happened. And all of the lies were meant to cover up Kaylee's death. But it was an accidental death. And the person primarily responsible for the cover-up wasn't Casey, but it was her father, George. Now, why would Casey go along with this? Well, it's because George had abused Casey her whole life, and silence about what her father was doing was her way of life. It was ingrained in her. Lying was her defense mechanism, and she never stopped. And this is so brilliant in so many ways because it explains everything about Casey. Why is Casey the way she is? Why does she lie about everything? Because she's been being abused her whole life and told to lie. And conditioned to lie, and conditioned to protect the family. And because of that, when this happens, she goes along with something that no one else would go along with. Most parents would not go along with this. Most parents, if they find their child in the pool, the first thing they're going to do is call 911. They're not going to assume she's dead, and they're not going to assume she can't be brought back. They're going to call 911. That's what all parents would do, frankly. But not Casey, because she's conditioned to do otherwise.
Whew. Brett, I mean, this is unlike any other opening statement from a defense that you'll ever hear. I mean, it is just stunning because it is so starkly different from what the prosecution says in their opening statement, which, of course, is that Casey is responsible for the murder of her child. Here is a precise and vivid accounting of what the defense wants the jury to believe happened. And I say this is so starkly different than most defense openings you'll hear is because defense openings typically don't present such a clear picture of what happened. They just typically try to poke holes from the start. They say the prosecution has a high bar of reasonable doubt. We're not going to get to reasonable doubt. There's going to be so many problems with their witnesses, and they can't tell a coherent story, and none of the facts line up. And that's why, at the end of the day, when you're asked to deliberate, you'll see that the government has fallen well short of their high bar to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. I mean, what I just said to you is, in essence, every opening from a defense across the board. Rarely will you hear anything of this nature where they talk about a timeline and they give you a drastically alternate universe as to what happened. And the reason Brett said that this is such a brilliant tactic is because you have a lot of things pointing against you in this case for your client. Casey lies all the time, not just about what's happened in this case, but just on the regular, she lies all the time. There are already strange things happening with the family dynamics. I mean, no one is willing to speak within her family. You know, the stories about fights are then conveniently forgotten. There's so many just twists and turns that you have to make sense of, and they somehow are able to weave this story together into an alternate universe story to give the jury another story to go with other than the prosecution's.
And look, I mean, this is what won the case for him, in my view. We talked about how one of the things we wanted to find in this exploration of this case is what won it. How did Casey get away with it? I think going with this story, even though there are a ton of holes in it, and we're going to talk more in the next episode about all the holes that are there in it, and we'll talk about theories as well, and we'll explain what we think actually happened. But the fact that they were able to give the jury a story they could walk out with and kind of believe, I think was enough. I don't know why. This jury was looking to acquit her. I don't know if it was just the makeup of the jury. Jose Baez picked a perfect jury. These were just weird people who don't watch television. I don't know what it was. I don't know what was going on with this jury. But I'm pretty convinced they were looking to acquit her. You don't acquit somebody of murdering their child in 11 hours if you're not looking for a reason to do it. And they gave them a reason. And this story was one they could believe at least enough to say, I can't say for certain that didn't happen. I can't say that she didn't die in an accident and that everything that happened after it was just the cover-up.
And Brett, this was a high-risk, high-reward proposition for the defense because guess who's going to testify? This is no shocker. George, the person they are pinning the cover-up on, is going to testify, and he's not going to say what the defense has said. And so we already know off the bat, the defense knows off the bat, their story is going to be rebut by the person they put at the center of the cover-up. And that is high risk. But they do that, and the jury is kind of faced head on with having to make a decision about who's telling the truth.
And I think they had seen enough of George and they had seen enough of Cindy that they knew George wasn't going to get on that stand and react the way that a normal person who is the grandfather of a murdered girl would react if he was accused of being involved in the cover-up. Oh, and by the way, molesting his daughter by the daughter who probably killed the granddaughter. They know he's not going to react that way. So we're going to talk about his testimony and some other testimony that comes in. But I think it was a huge risk. It was a huge gamble. But I think the defense, I think they knew what they were doing. So, well, look, I don't know if we're going to finish in 6 episodes, but I think we are on track for 7 tops. That's what I'm saying. We might get done in 6, but I'm saying no more than 7. So I think we've done a really good job, Alice. We should be commended by the people who claim that we go off on tangents all the time. We're doing a fantastic job on this.
I mean, we do go on tangents, but we've tried to keep it. We tried to keep it tight here.
Yeah, just somewhat related tangents, I think, is the key. Well, we are, like I said, we are closing in on the end of this. If you guys have thoughts, please send us emails, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for all your social media. Hello to those of you watching on YouTube and to those of you getting your episodes ad-free and early on Patreon. Well, Alice, is there anything else you want to add before we sign off for this week?
No, but this has been invigorating talking about the actual evidence because I've been waiting to get to this part because it's only now when we're talking about the evidence that we can actually analyze and see whether the jury got it right or wrong. So there's still more to come, but there was a lot today. So come back for additional evidence that came out in court so we can talk about what actually happened in that jury room.
That's right, Alice. And it has been invigorating. Hopefully I will make it to next week. And if I do, we will be back then with more on Casey Anthony. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. Sorry, I keep talking. I need words for you. Where are your words?
How about healthy?
Healthy. I like that. I'm going with that. You convinced me.
I'm sorry.
Okay. It's okay. Just continue to twist the knife in my lung.
Rub it in.
Even more. Yeah. Okay. Here we go. You ready?
Can't do that because the Constitution guarantees that you can only be charged. You can only be charged. Convicted.
Charged, tried, convicted,
tried.
Anything.
It has to go to the end, right? Once.
All this month, stream the funniest films for free on Pluto TV. Watch comedy classics like Anchorman, The Legend of Ron Burgundy, and Mean Girls. Or drop in for a Tyler Perry marathon with a Madea family funeral and Medea's witness protection. Pluto TV also has hundreds of channels and thousands of movies and TV shows like Get Shorty, Be Cool, Key and Peele, Comedy in Color, and more. And no contracts, no subscriptions, no fees, no joke. So download the Pluto TV app on your favorite streaming device and start laughing today. Pluto TV, drop in, watch free.